Good evening. Welcome to this second event in our series this year on polarization and civil disagreement. I'm Paul Carisse. I'm the director of this new department at Arizona State University, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. Very glad you could be here this evening. The series as a whole includes individual speaker events and interviews, which is our format this evening, but also dialogue events. And in February, we will have a two-day conference. And as you probably saw outside, you can pick up information on the school and on the entire schedule of speaker events in this series. The school is delighted to be co-sponsoring, the whole series with two Arizona State University partners, the Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. This series on polarization and remedies for it is the sequel to our first year series on free speech and intellectual diversity in higher education and American society. We're editing the presentations from that into a published book, and as you can see, we have Arizona PBS here as another partner in the series. They recorded all of the events in last year's series, produced their own series for local broadcast on Channel 8, and all of those are on the school's website and also on our YouTube channel, which you can look for. The title of the PBS series was Free Speech Challenge of Our Times. And they'll be doing the same for all of the presentations and the two-day conference in this year's series. Well over 3,000 members of the Arizona State University and broader Phoenix communities attended the events in last year's series. We ask you to spread the word about this year's series. Our aim is to provide a public forum for civil disagreement and debate. I'm glad to see tonight faculty, colleagues from ASU, but also members of the community here as well. So please do spread the word. All of the information is on our website as well as the information outside. So just a few words about the mission of this brand new department at Arizona State University, and then I'll introduce our distinguished speaker. The School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership seeks to restore the connection between liberal education and civic education in a university, and then to undertake civic education with our broader community. Our students discuss great works of civic, economic, and political thought in our courses, and we also organize this series and other speaker events to promote discussion of academic and civic issues. So that both in the classroom and beyond, we provide a space for robust but civil debate. The planning committee for last year's series thought we should engage in one of the more contentious issues in higher education of the day, the rise of extreme rhetoric and actions, even to the point of violence, about the very issue of who can speak on campuses. The intellectual and civic polarization behind that free speech controversy prompted us to formulate the theme for this year's series, a sequel to address that broader civic crisis of angry disagreements and self-sorting into parties and schools of thought, demonizing those with whom we disagree, all of which we now call polarization or negative partisanship. We thought that polarized and compartmentalized intellectual climate on campuses is both a symptom and cause of America's broader polarization. And so we thought we had a duty to confront all of these issues in these two public series. In our undergraduate program, the school addresses these issues by offering a major and a minor, great works of civic, economic, political, and moral thought, supplemented by opportunities for internships, civic affairs experiences like this speaker series. We have global intensive experience courses, which we've already sent to India, and we'll send a group of students on a course to Israel and the West Bank in the coming year, all as a foundation for understanding and practicing leadership in the 21st century and America and in our globalized world. We also think in general that a return to some fundamental themes, ideas, debates might provide a broader and calming perspective in our polarized and divided times. And the students here should get information on the tables outside about our courses and our major and our minor. All of that leads me to our distinguished speaker this evening. Our aim both in last year's series and again this year is to convene a high-level debate encompassing a wide range of academic and civic views. Our opening speaker in September, Jonah Goldberg, addressed the causes of our polarization and possible remedies from a conservative intellectual and political view. We're delighted this evening to have a prominent liberal progressive scholar to take up the dialogue in the series. Mark Lilla is a professor of humanities at Columbia University and a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books and other publications worldwide. He's just back from a speaking tour in France. His recent books on the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thought include The Shipwrecked Mind on Political Reaction, The Stillborn God, Religion, Politics, and the Modern West, and The Reckless Mind, Intellectuals in Politics. His 2017 book, which is the basis for his remarks tonight, is The Once and Future Liberal, After Identity Politics. Our format tonight will begin with Professor Lilla offering prepared remarks, and then in part two of the evening, I will be joined up on the stage by Kenja Hassan of Arizona State University's Office of Government and Community Relations. The two of us will interview Professor Lilla and pose some follow-up questions. And then in part three of the evening, you can see we have a microphone here. Professor Lilla will take questions from the audience. And we invite everyone to stay for what's left of the reception afterward. One request from our speaker is that you liberate yourself from your devices. Put them away and request that no pictures be taken from devices and no checking of email and such. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mark Lilla on identity and citizenship.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Peter, and thank you all for coming. The book that Peter just mentioned, The Once and Future Liberal, which I'll be speaking about tonight, grew out of an article that I did in the New York Times in the heat of the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump in 2016. That article led to quite a controversy. It was the most read political op-ed article of the year. The only articles that were read more often were an article on why men like to marry Melanias and have Ivankas for daughters. And the other article was why your marriage will end. So I got a sense of the priorities of politics in our country, I guess. Anyway, the article led to a really partisan polemic and not much engagement, I felt, with the argument that I had made. I was concerned about, I was addressing liberals as a centrist liberal myself, about the declining fortunes of liberalism and how over 30 years that prepared the way for the last election. I argued that identity movement politics as a strategy was in part responsible, and that we needed somehow to reach out to the country and develop a rhetoric for the country as a whole. The response was so intense and intensely negative that I ended up writing a book. And I'm happy to answer questions about that experience, about the reaction to the book, some of my critics, anything you'd like. I'm not going to summarize all of that or burden you with a partisan polemic. Instead, I want to use tonight to develop an important theme that I raise at the end of the book and don't develop adequately, and a theme that I'd like to write more about in the future. And that is the relationship between identity and citizenship. So let me begin with a little history, a little potted history, I suppose. I think that the history of American politics since the Progressive Era can be roughly divided into two periods. I call these periods dispensations for reasons I'll explain in a second. The first, the Roosevelt dispensation, stretch from the Progressive Era or the New Deal to the era of the Civil Rights Movement and the Great Society. The second, what I call the Reagan dispensation, began in 1980 and has been brought to an end with the election of Donald Trump. Each of these dispensations projected an inspiring image of America's destiny and a distinctive catechism of doctrines that set the terms of political debate. The Roosevelt dispensation pictured an America where citizens pulled together to guard each other against risk, hardship, and the denial of fundamental rights. Its watchwords were solidarity, opportunity, and public duty, even when it did not always deliver those things. The Reagan dispensation, though, pictured a more individualistic America, one where families and small businesses and churches would flourish once they were freed from the shackles of the state. Its watchwords were self-reliance and minimal government. The first dispensation, I would say, was political. The second dispensation was anti-political. Now, this term dispensation comes from evangelical Protestant theology, though the concept is as old as biblical religion. It conceives of history as divided into distinct eras when different sets of rules legitimately apply. Defining a political dispensation is somewhat difficult. That's because it is not only animated by ideas and principles, it can't just be learned about through books, it's also grounded in feelings and perceptions that give those principles and arguments psychological force. When a new dispensation arrives, material reality may be unchanged, yet somehow everything looks and feels different. Now, what I call the Roosevelt dispensation took hold in the 1930s and began when liberals responded to conservatives' failures to confront the two great challenges of the day, which were economic collapse and the spread of fascism. Once in power, New Deal liberals developed a catechism that was summed up in the famous Four Freedoms speech of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1941. Then he declared that the four pillars on which the United States stood were freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. This expanded notion of freedom, along with the experiences of the Great Depression and World War II, established a new aspirational principle. According to this principle, all citizens deserve respect as citizens. We have equal rights, but we also have duties towards each other, and we can legitimately use government to fulfill those duties. Now, of course, political principles are never political reality, but they are the way in which we announce our intention to try to reshape political reality. Attached to this principle was a range of feelings and expectations. As I said, the experience of the Depression and the war and the New Deal established an unprecedented sense of solidarity in America, at least white America. And that solidarity, in turn, determined the outer limits of political debate and action. In 1946, for example, no one would have responded to the free market rhetoric of Ronald Reagan. In the decades that followed, even Republicans had to take into account the rising expectations of post-war solidarity and government action. Young people here may not know it, but in fact it was Richard Nixon who first proposed a minimum income for all Americans and universal health insurance. This Roosevelt dispensation ended in the 1970s for reasons that are familiar to you, the usual litany: Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, overregulation, activist courts, the decline of our major cities, crimes, and more. The country was ready for a new approach, and somehow Jimmy Carter's sensible shoes and sensible sweater and sensible advice to turn down the thermostat just didn't cut it. And so enter Ronald Reagan, stage right, very right. After Carter delivered his diagnosis of America's malaise, Reagan declared, "I find no national malaise. I find nothing wrong with the American people," adding, "Twilight? Not in America. Here it's sunrise every day." Now, of course, Reaganism didn't just happen. It was neither inevitable, nor was it the result of a coup d'etat. Rather, Reaganism in part reflected a new social reality. Though the principle of solidarity was widely recognized in the post-war period, America, in fact, was becoming a more individualistic society again, materially and in terms of cultural attitudes. 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth and technological advance had reshaped how Americans lived and our sense of ourselves. White families left central cities and moved to a suburban toy frontier with other settlers, all living in split-level air-conditioned wagons. Virtually every aspect of middle-class life was transformed out there, making ours a much more atomized society. Starting in the 70s, what the writer Tom Wolfe called the Me Decade, a new set of principles became prominent. Personal choice, individual rights, self-definition. We now speak these words as if a wedding vow. We hear them in school, we hear them on television, we hear them in stuffy Wall Street boardrooms, we hear them in light-filled Silicon Valley playpens, we hear them in church. We hear them so often that it's hard for us to think or talk about any subject now except in these self-regarding terms. And so, in a sense, it was to be expected that our politics would eventually catch up and be infected with the same self-regard, and that our political vocabulary would be revised to match this new reality. And so, in fact, a new libertarian catechism was unveiled by President Reagan and its followers. It was not based on the four freedoms. It was based on four simple articles of faith. One, that the good life is that of self-reliant individuals. Individuals embedded in families and churches and small communities, but not as citizens of a republic with reciprocal duties. Second, that building wealth must take priority to redistributing it. 3, that the freer markets are, the more they will grow and enrich everyone. And 4, that government, to quote Reagan, is the problem. Not tyrannical government, not inefficient government, not unjust government. Government itself. Note that this Reagan catechism was not conservative in any traditional interpretation of conservatism. It treated self-determination as sacrosanct and more important than traditional ties of dependence and obligation. It had next to nothing to say about the natural needs of groups, from families to nations, or our obligation to meet them. It had a vocabulary for discussing mine and yours, but not a vocabulary for invoking the common good or addressing class and other social realities. In the popular imagination, Ronald Reagan was revered for restoring a sense of American patriotism after the 60s and 70s. But the new patriotism wasn't really political. Even military service was marketed differently during the Reagan dispensation. The slogan in the commercials back there was, "Be all you can be." Just try to imagine Tom Hanks hitting the beaches of Normandy saying that to his troops. The word government took on a weird echo during the Reagan dispensation. Republicans spoke it as if an alien spaceship had descended on the happy residents of middle suburb USA, sucking up into itself all the resources, corrupting the children, and enslaving the population. Grover Norquist, Ronald Reagan's fanatical St. Paul, expressed the new outlook with remarkable and radical clarity. My ideal citizen, he once remarked, is a self-employed, homeschooling, IRA-owning guy with a concealed carry permit, because that guy doesn't need the goddamn government for anything. He went to Harvard, but he talks like that. Now, a genuine social conservative might object to what I've said. He or she might insist that there was a moral dimension to Reaganism because it left moral education to the churches. Yet what was striking about American religion during the Reagan years was how easily it had adapted to the ambient libertarianism of the time. Before suburbanization, mainline Christian churches had thrived in ethnic urban neighborhoods and rural small towns where people knew each other. In the suburbs, people began drifting away, or they joined new evangelical groups whose doctrines were remarkably free of dogma and guilt and certainly social obligation. Over time, committing to even one of these churches proved too constraining, and we Americans got into the habit of what's called grazing, attending different churches on different Sundays, depending on how the mood strikes us. Even the Bible began to sing a different tune, one tied to success. Certain evangelical denominations have been infected with the same individualism, selfishness, and superficiality that infects other sectors of American life. Members may still tie to their churches, but they seem to reject outright the notion that taxes, too, are a kind of democratic tithe that goes to help fellow citizens. Charity, like tipping, is now being left to the customer's discretion. The Reagan dispensation, by my count, lasted 36 years. So what were liberals, my team, up to during that time? You might have thought that faced with a radical anti-political vision of the nation, that liberals would have countered with an imaginative and hopeful political one, one that evoked what we share as American citizens and what we might accomplish together. You might have thought that faced with Republicans' steady acquisition of institutional power, they would have poured their energies into winning elections at every level of government and in every region of the country, reaching out especially to working-class Americans who used to be the base of the party. You might have thought that faced with dogmatic libertarianism, liberal educators in schools and universities would have taught young people that they share a destiny with their fellow citizens and have duties toward them, that whatever the differences among us, we are one nation, or at least we seek to become one. You might have thought a lot of reasonable things, and you would have been wrong. Instead, American liberals got out of the vision business altogether. They redirected their energies from party politics to movement politics and became especially enchanted with identity movements in particular. Little by little, they found themselves unable to articulate what we share as citizens and what binds us as a nation. And the further left you went, the more liberals spoke of the country in terms of groups and their differences. However accurate sociologically, this mindset has proved electorally suicidal, and it has contributed to the massive transfer of political power in large sections of the country from the Democratic Party to an increasingly radical Republican one. The consequences have been perverse in the extreme. Unable to win elections in the vast middle of America, especially the South, liberals have become unable to protect the very groups they profess to care about. We are living in an era of retrenchment. Things that we thought we already won, whether it's the right to abortion or especially voting rights for African Americans, are being chipped away at in state after state in this country that is controlled by Republicans. That is the great scandal of our time. And that is the central partisan point of my book. You cannot help anyone if you do not have institutional power. That is job one. Now, there's a mystery at the core of every suicide. But a backstory can be told about the conditions and events and choices that set the stage for the ultimate climax. The story of how a once successful liberal politics of solidarity became a failed liberal politics of difference is not a simple one. Perhaps the best way to begin is with a slogan from back in the 60s, "The personal is the political." To understand this slogan and why it proved so compelling, we need to go back to those suburbs I already described and to see what else was going on back in the 50s and 60s. And one striking development was that a significant fraction of the suburban middle class became convinced that they were undergoing what was called at the time an identity crisis. This term was coined by a psychologist by the name of Erik Erikson to describe the anxiety amid plenty that he found in our adoptive country after the war, after coming from war-torn Europe. Alexis de Tocqueville had diagnosed this syndrome a century before, but Erikson's restatement of it in terms of identity politics caught the public's imagination and apparently people's inner experience. And the more the frontier settlers freed themselves from economic and social necessity, the more confused they were about what to do with their liberty and their wealth. What would a meaningful, authentic life look like now that it was possible? This question was especially compelling for young people who had known only peace and prosperity, not all those college students in bobby socks and brush cuts were surfing during spring break, as the movies back then portrayed them. Many of them were reading the recent translated French existentialists, the stories of Franz Kafka, the meditations of Thomas Merton, and the plays of Samuel Beckett. This phrase, "the personal is political," became a slogan for this generation. Originally, it was interpreted to mean that everything that seems strictly private, sexuality, the family, the workplace, is in fact political. That there are no spheres of life exempt from the struggle for power. And that's what made the idea so radical. But the phrase could also be taken in a more romantic sense, that what we think of as political action is in fact nothing but personal activity, an expression of me and how I define myself. Or as we would say today, political engagement is a reflection of my identity. Over time, this romantic view won out over the radical one. And on the left, the idea got rooted, to reverse the formula, that the political is the personal. Liberals and progressives continued to seek social justice, but they also now wanted there to be no space between what they felt inside and what they did in the world. They wanted their political engagements to mirror how they understood and defined themselves as individuals. And they wanted that self-definition to be recognized. This was a total innovation on the left. Socialism had no time for individual recognition. It was too busy tearing down capitalism. Rushing towards the revolution, it divided the world into exploiting bosses and exploited workers from every background. New Deal liberals were also indifferent to individual identity. They thought and spoke in terms of equal rights and equal protections for all. Even the early identity movements of the 50s and 60s to secure the rights of African Americans, Latinos, women, and gays that have done so much for the country appealed to our sense of shared humanity and citizenship in order to bring about change. All that began to change when the New Left shattered in the 1970s, in no small part over identity issues. Blacks complained that white movement leaders were racist. Feminists complained that they were sexist. Lesbians complained that straight feminists were homophobic. The main enemies were no longer capitalism and the military-industrial complex. They were fellow movement members who were not, as we would say today, sufficiently woke. Just to repeat, these social movements for African Americans, Latinos, women, and gays have made this country a more tolerant and more just a more inclusive place than it was 50 years ago. But engagement with them has also transformed the way liberals think about their country and engage with their fellow citizens. Movement politics, over time, tends to become disuniting. The forces at work, you might say, are centrifugal. They encourage splits into smaller and smaller factions, obsessed with single issues and practicing rituals of ideological one-upmanship. Symbols take on outsized significance, especially in identity-based movements. Ask yourself why we started with 4 letters, LGBT, and now more letters are being added. This is the logic of movement politics, to split constantly. The forces of party politics, on the other hand, are basically centripetal. They encourage factions and interests to come together to work out common goals and strategies, and they oblige everyone to think, or at least to speak, about the common good. The Democratic Party's inability to articulate a coherent vision of that good and how to achieve it through active government is basically owing to the fact that the mindset of the identity movement politics, the way of doing politics, not the issues themselves, have captured the party itself. When the party looks outside its window, it sees tribes. And when tribe members look at themselves, they not only see group members, they now see themselves as individuals, as possessors of an identity that sets them off from the rest of the world, that makes them the individuals that they are. Identity today is more often understood not as a social category, but as a thing, an inner homunculus, a little ghost in the machine, the self of the self, the unique little thing composed of parts tinted by race and sex and gender, formed by history, but also by my own choices. Interesting, the first on the left to complain about this change were Marxists, and rightly so. It's no accident they suggested that an ideology of personal identity developed in our universities in the age of Reagan and remains strong. While many students study business and economics in order to make money for themselves, others are taking classes where they learn how special their very selves are. And many take both sorts of classes, satisfying both their pocketbooks and their parents and their conscience. The intellectual and material forces of the age are working together to keep young Americans self-involved and to convince them that narcissism with attitude is both good business and good politics. The Marxists say identity is not the future of the left. Identity is not hostile to neoliberalism. Identity is Reagan for lefties. For 4 decades now, American politics has been dominated by 2 ideologies that have encouraged and even celebrated the unmaking of citizens. On the right, an ideology that questions the existence of the common good and denies our obligation to help fellow citizens through government action. On the left, an ideology institutionalized in colleges and universities that fetishizes our individual and group attachments and casts a shadow of suspicion over the word we, which sometimes is pronounced on my campus we. This at a time when, precisely because America has become more diverse and individualistic, there is greater need, not less, to cultivate political fellow feeling. What's missing is a vocabulary for articulating what makes this a republic, not a campsite or a parking lot or a battleground for warring tribes. A vocabulary that articulates what makes us citizens and not just members of groups or consumers in the market or autonomous elementary particles spinning in space. A vocabulary that might appeal to our collective democratic imagination. In short, a vocabulary for modern citizenship. Citizens are made. They are not born. Sustaining civic feeling is extremely difficult, which is why democracies are subject to entropy. When the bond of citizenship is badly cast or has been allowed to weaken, there's a natural tendency for sub-political attachments to become more paramount in people's minds. As we see in Eastern Europe, for example, democracies without democrats do not last. They decay into oligarchy or theocracy or ethnic nationalism, tribalism, authoritarian rule, or some combination of these. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that there are signs of each of these pathologies in American democratic life today. What's to be done? Frankly, I'm not sure anything can be, at least for now. I realize as good Americans, you demand a happy ending to every story. You want to walk out of the movie with a smile on your face. But I'm about to disappoint you. We have become that oxymoron, a libertarian society. Half the country seems to believe that we don't need the goddamn government for anything. And certainly we have no overriding civic duty towards each other. The other half demands government action for issues and groups that matter to them. But they have disdain for fellow citizens who don't see the world precisely as they see it. Anti-government sentiment and identity consciousness are here for now. And they can't just be wished away, in part because we live in the kind of society we do now that I described. All I think one can do is try to persuade the country's tribes that appealing to our shared citizenship and trying to shore it up is in their best short-term and long-term political interests properly understood. I have no idea how one would do one on the right, and I don't care. Though perhaps the vogue for economic nationalism will provide an opening. But I do have some thoughts about how to persuade my own tribe, which I do a little bit at the end of my book. The argument goes like this. To begin, citizenship is a political status. It is not an identity. It's nothing more than a status. To say that we are citizens, all citizens, is not to say politics is everything, and it's certainly not to say that we're all alike in every respect. It is a social fact and a wonderful fact that we are a diverse country and that many Americans today are highly aware of the groups they belong to. But there is no reason why they cannot simultaneously think of themselves as political citizens like everyone else. Another reason to think and speak in terms of political citizenship is that this status and meaning can be expanded. The American right today uses the term citizenship as a tool of exclusion, directed especially against immigrants. Liberals traditionally have seen the term as a generous tool for inclusion. The history of the citizenship idea in the West began as an idea that you were neither a slave or a subject to a monarch or a pope. It was a formal distinction, but it was limited to white men with property. In the 19th century, in Europe and the US, the question became who deserved to be citizens, and slowly the franchise started to be expanded to those without property, women, former slaves, and so on. In the 20th century, it was the question for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is what is materially necessary to actually enjoy the benefits of democratic citizenship? And this provided a way to make a case for the modern welfare state. I think all liberal political claims, no matter what they are, can be formulated in terms of shared citizenship, either because we share it and we have duties to each other, or some people are being excluded as full citizens. And the concept of citizenship has an additional advantage. It provides a political language for speaking about solidarity that transcends our identity attachments without denying that they exist. It provides an opening for discussing our duty towards each other. If there's anything missing in our society, it's an ideology of duty. Democratic citizenship implies reciprocal rights and duties. We have duties because we have rights, and we only enjoy rights because we also do our duty. The political creeds of our time make it virtually impossible to discuss duty. It was striking that during the Reagan years, for all his talk about America as the last defense of tyranny, against tyranny, not once in his presidency did Reagan ask the public to make sacrifices to defend freedom at home or abroad. He and his successors found it much easier to expand the deficit, then rely on an all-volunteer force, and mainly poor soldiers, and then give soldiers priority on planes and thank them for their service. But why even do that, Grover Norquist might say. They got paid. The left rightly wants an active government to address common problems. And so it especially has a stake in motivating a sense of civic duty. But if liberals today banish the word we to the outer reaches of political discourse, there is no long-term future for liberalism. Historically, liberals have called upon us to ensure equal rights. They want us to feel a sense of solidarity with the unfortunate and the excluded and then help them. We is where everything begins. But by abandoning it, or even just casting a cloud of suspicion over it, identity liberals have landed themselves in a strategic contradiction. They call for political action, say, to assist Group X, and they demand it from people whom they define as not X, and whose experiences, they sometimes say, cannot be compared to their own. But if that's the case, why should you expect these other people to respond to your demands? Why would non-Xers give a damn about Xers unless they believe they shared something with them? Why should we expect them to feel anything at all? I can tell you that when I pose this question to students sometimes who are heavily engaged in identity politics on campus, they not only don't have an answer to the question, the problem has never even occurred to them. Now, of course, people in different identity groups do. I mean, we share a lot of problems, but we also do have different experiences and problems. Take an example. A black male motorist who was pulled over repeatedly by the police for driving while black, an all too common occurrence in our country. I'm not a black male motorist, never will be, and I don't pretend that I can fully share the feeling of humiliation and rage in the face of that. But I need some way to identify with the black motorist if I'm to be affected by his experience. And the more the differences between us are emphasized, the more I'm told that I cannot possibly understand that experience or speak about it, the less I'm going to care. But there is, in fact, something we share. We are both citizens, and citizens stick together. This, to my mind, is what distinguishes American liberalism from American conservatism over the past century. Liberals believe that we are a republic of citizens and that we need more citizens, not fewer. Liberals believe that citizens are not roadkill. They are not collateral damage. They are not the tail of the distribution. A citizen, simply by virtue of being a citizen, is one of us. If we stand shoulder to shoulder to defend the country against foreign adversaries, we must stand together at home. We're all Americans and we owe each other. Now, I fail to see how my fellow liberals could object to this formulation. But as I'm learning, they do. The resistance on the left to the argument I'm making, and it's being echoed by a lot of people in democratic politics today, I'm speaking mainly about people in universities and the media, shows just how intense the identity fever has become. And one has to be blind not to see and recognize that it has provoked and to some extent legitimized the explicit white identity politics that's being exploited on the right today. We're making breakfast for Steve Bannon every morning. And that is why there is no happy ending to this talk. All one can do is make the case and hope that eventually, after not too many defeats, the fever passes. But if it doesn't, then I fear that the populist wave that brought our current president to power will only intensify. And that would open an even darker chapter in our nation's history. Thank you.
Well, there may not be a happy ending, but there is time for questions. That's at least some recompense. So I want to introduce my partner here for the second part of the evening, and then, as I mentioned, in the third part, we invite the audience to ask questions. So I'm joined now by Kenja Hassan, who is the Director of Cultural Relations for Arizona State University's Office of Government and Community Engagement. She works to connect Arizona State University with ethnically diverse communities in the state. Through ASU, Kenja has launched the State of Arizona Reports, a project that helps Arizonans to document and celebrate diversity within the state. She holds a bachelor's degree in religion from Princeton University and a master's from ASU in religious studies. Both degrees had emphasized study of American Indian religious ties to the land. And she's currently pursuing, in all her spare time, a doctoral degree at ASU in the College of Nursing and Health Innovation to understand health disparities. So Kenja, thank you for being with us. I'm going to open with a question for Mark, and then Kenja will pose some questions, and we'll see how much time we have. In the book, you talk about one of the causes of polarization being a higher education culture among liberal, progressive people that is not tolerant of debate or disagreement about ideas and issues in the same way. And you locate this in the turn toward identity studies in universities. So as you mentioned in your lecture, one cause of our polarization would be a sort of disintegrating view from the right, a libertarian view. But this is the disintegrating, divisive view from the left. Could you talk a little bit more about that, the intellectual sources of polarization?
I think I understand it better since I've written the book, and I go out and talk to students all over the country and also abroad. Because this is also starting to develop in Europe as well. What happens if you think of political engagement as an expression of your identity? Then any attack on your political views or criticism or another view doesn't just feel like an attack on your politics, but seems an attack on you personally. I'm very struck with young people now that instead of saying I disagree with something, they'll say, that makes me uncomfortable, or it drives me crazy that you say that, as if their personal feelings have some kind of standing here, right? And what that encourages you to do, if you are offended, and in fact, if you thought of political engagement like that, it would feel internally as if your identity was being attacked, and you would not want to hang around with people who, in your eyes, you might think are denying your legitimacy. But what's missing is the sense that whatever my identity, I have arguments that go with my views, and those arguments are up for grabs, and we can engage that way, and afterwards we can go out for a beer, right? But we can have an engagement like that. And part of what comes along with that, I think, is also there's less interest among young people today in a wider ideology and other issues. Yeah, I'm going to talk like the old man today, but you know, back in the day, you know, you weren't, you know, you didn't come to the table if you didn't have a view on foreign policy, a view on economic policy, a view on social policy, a view on race relations in America, a view on family life. And of course you were convinced at the age of 18 that all of that connected and you explained everything. But at least it got you out of yourself. And so many things in our culture that have nothing to do with politics encourage a kind of narcissism. I mean in the precise sense, I don't mean selfishness. I mean a constant looking within and only seeing oneself in every social relation.
Okay.
So to continue with that same line of questioning, you seem to express this considerable amount of frustration with college students who very intentionally pursue courses of study that teach them about themselves.
Right.
So their history, literature that's come out of people who are like them. But in the book, you seem to set it up as if it's a either-or situation. You can either learn about yourself or be a good citizen. And I would love to hear you think, talk, write, speak more about how things can be a both-and situation. Because for a lot of students, these are the classes that make them want to become politically engaged or become aware or become motivated.
Yeah.
And I don't see that genie going back into the bottle. So now that it's out, how can it be a both-and situation?
Well, no, that's exactly what I would want. There is no going back in the bottle, and it's a good thing too. I mean, there are disadvantages to it, but there are advantages of it too. You know, we've opened up the canon, we've opened up our sense of what needs to be studied, which should encourage people to take classes on different groups that are not your own group. So logically, there's no reason why one can't do that. But as a psychological matter, it's not happening. That you know the rhetoric of many of the groups, and it's not just on campus, but it filters into the media, and it also filters into Hollywood, gets us focused on looking at the country as if we're nothing but different tribes that need to be represented. And I have no problem holding in my head, and I'm sure you don't, the idea that you would be, you know, that you would take a class in something, that a class in African American history or literature would stir you up to want to get engaged in Black Lives Matter. Then the next step would be, and then what you would want to do is to make sure that we hold political power. And holding political power in America, exercising it, requires winning elections, and because we're a federal system, it's not sufficient just to capture the flag and win the presidency, or even Congress. You must be present in every state. So that next step then requires you to say, okay, this is why I got involved in politics. But in order to defend the causes I now care about, I need to be able to talk to a farmer in Iowa who doesn't support abortion. I need to somehow make the case there, to begin with, to defend African Americans in Iowa, but also in general, to make sure that you're in a party that has power and can defend lots of groups. And it's what's missing is the leap into institutional politics. And also what's required in institutional politics, you have to go to another part of the country. To begin with, you have to, at that moment, stop talking about yourself and do a lot of listening. And also, you have to learn in politics, institutional politics, to make trade-offs. And the word I keep hearing is not trade-offs, but compromises. Because compromise seems to be a bad word, because if you hold something to be just, why would you compromise on that? But political life, like adult life, is always making trade-offs among good things. And what I would want to encourage students who get fired up in this way is that they then understand they have to make this leap, which means they need to talk to a lot of people not like themselves and hear their stories too.
And so why do you put so much emphasis on the colleges and universities, and why not K-12, high schools, junior high schools, civics classes, where I don't even know if civics is still part of K-12 education.
You know, it's more than I
but
thought, but yeah, you're right. Well, what's interesting is that there was a study done, and it has this huge appendix with civic education courses taught in high schools all over America. And many of them are traditional, but a lot of them now see civic education as teaching how to be a political activist and get involved in movements. And it's not focused on the institutions and the necessity of winning elections. And I also focus on universities because if you come out of a university, you can get a certain distorted picture of American reality, which then gets reflected in Hollywood and also in the media. So for example, I surprise a lot of students when I tell them at Columbia, which is a very elite place on the East Coast, that 1 out of every 5 Americans self-identifies as evangelical. That shocks them. Now, they don't know evangelicals. I've never seen, maybe there's been a history course on American evangelicals, I've never seen it. But there are a lot of classes, let's say, on LGBT issues. Less than 1/2% of Americans are transgender. But if you look at American movies and television, you will see trans characters now. You will not see a religious family. You will not see a family struggling with their faith or going to a prayer meeting, unless it's to make fun of people. You don't get a sense of just the sociological reality of the country. I mean, you know, I joke sometimes, some students seem to think that 1 out of every 5 Americans is LGBT and 1/2% is evangelical. It's not quite that bad. But you really lose touch and become part of the bubble if you've come out of this university mold that focuses so much on groups, I think. Maybe your experience has been different, I don't know.
Well, I've been out of school for 25 years.
No, but you're in a university, so you see these things.
I am, but I don't see it as strongly as you described it. Now, I do see the individualism and the focus on materialism. I still see that happening, but I don't see the sort of hyper separation that you're talking about. And ASU students can probably clarify that for me if they ask you questions. So I would like to see that. But I also feel like you described something that's changed in American universities over the last couple of decades, where when I was in school, the classes you describe were the motivating factors for many students who are now politically engaged. And it didn't make them feel separated, it made them feel more engaged in being American citizens. So I'm perplexed by the idea that these now are creating these divisive spaces. And how do you, when you talk to students about these issues, how have you responded or specifically encouraged them to think about re-engaging in a more citizenship type ideology?
Yeah, well, I'm sad to say that I don't get to engage with them much because they don't come to the talks if they don't agree. Students tend to do that less and less. They tend to attend events. I'd love to have some hecklers. I almost never get some hecklers. I was heckled at one thing, but that was it because they're self-selecting. And so I've tried to write the book, and I try to make this practical case that they've got to go out. But what I find is the intensity they have of this feeling that I personally need to be heard. This is about me and my experience. Often the students I see are quite privileged, right? No matter what their backgrounds are, generally at Columbia. And often, they're appealing to an experience that is not their personal experience, but that gives them a kind of credibility, a kind of identity, I guess.
Street cred?
Street credibility there. And I just find it's not just students, when they're in school, but I've had a lot of, I will say, I've had a lot of interviews with podcasts and things that come from a very identity perspective. And mainly what I hear is, you don't understand what we experience. I said, I may not understand, but you want me to care about your experience? Mm-hmm. We need a link. You want to do something about your experience? You don't got to talk to me. You got to get out of Manhattan and Brooklyn. You got to go to another part of the country. And that seems like a little revelation. Whether it affects anything, I don't know.
I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. Not a happy ending, but a model that you cite in the book at one point, Martin Luther King Jr., someone concerned about inequality, that the group community from which he came not being fairly treated, but arguing that in public in a way that emphasized common American principles. Could you talk about that as a model perhaps for students to study today, and a model that could be adapted to new issues and circumstances?
Well, I wouldn't clean up his rhetoric. I mean, his rhetoric was bringing the judgment of God down on America, right? That you read the letter from Birmingham jail, and it's as strong as anything in the book of Isaiah or the book of Jeremiah. And it is a call to conscience. And so it's not just that, oh, why don't we all get along? But it's based on the presumption that if I make this call to conscience, eventually you're going to feel something. And if not, there'll be enough of us to change things and take power from those who do not share that feeling. But you would not engage in that rhetoric. Did you not presume that we shared something in common, basic presuppositions?
The other famous writing from 1963 is the speech that he gives on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., in which it's rather extraordinary that he cites the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as if he believes in them, rather than to say they're bankrupt, look at what they've done for slaves and the descendants of slaves. Right. Instead, he calls to a common, it's sort of a civic conscience he calls people to, right? And
also, if you focus on citizenship, you can say that we're being excluded. If you cannot drive your car as a black man in America without getting stopped, you are not protected by the laws of our country. And what you want to focus on the fact is this is our fellow citizen. I mean, it would be good if people understood each other's history and all of that, and that slowly happens through education. But when it comes to politics, you've got to appeal to something that we share, because what you need, and what Martin Luther King did, he shamed people. How dare you? You say you're a Christian, how dare you treat the fellow children of God like this? And we need to be able to shame people for not taking care of their fellow citizens.
Okay, we have a microphone in the middle of the main aisle there. If you would please abide by a couple of rules. Learned this from John Carlson, right? A couple of rules about brief questions. Please keep it brief, and please make sure it's a question, if you would. Thanks very much.
I was wondering, especially the last question you were just answering it, if people aren't aware of a problem or that there's an issue, how do you fix it? It sounds to me identity politics means minority or marginalized people's issues. So how can we not, have that be a part of, our politics? And with that being said, to me it sounds more like, wouldn't you agree, it's more about a messaging rather than just the fact we care about our identities, our heritages, the things that make us who we are?
What we should hope for is that when someone is being discriminated against or not being given respect as a citizen, that something wells up in us an emotion that is there. But that emotion, if I don't belong to the group, has to come from something else. Now, it can come from, let's say, a religious foundation of the equality of human beings. The problem is that the Bible, in America, doesn't teach that so much anymore. We've got a success gospel. We don't have a lot of judgment in our churches about charity and duty. And so failing that, I want to think about something else, a bond that we can emphasize, so that people will be outraged when someone who shares this status with you is denied equality. And what is striking to me is that people on the left who care about these issues have this. But people on the radical right don't share it at all, because they don't think that they share anything with you. They don't share anything with these groups. And you've got to find a way to get hooks into them so that your appeal has some pull. And if you just emphasize differences, they're going to withdraw into their difference.
I would like to know your opinion on the question of the natural progress of societies. You know, the notion that as time progresses, societies become more liberal, and then of the current trend, if it is in part the natural result of prior social changes. Because to me, this is a reason I abandoned the left many years ago and have since become more reactionary. Because to me, it seems as if the many social changes we're seeing today that are so caustic, as you've described, have their roots in the prior. And if this is the natural case, then what is there to be done?
I think things are always up for grabs. History is always up for grabs. I mean, there's certain conditions that once they're there might not disappear. Alas, we're never going to be able to uninvent the internet or cell phones and all of that, so we have to learn to work around that. But, you're too young to remember the rhetoric of the 1990s, when everyone was convinced that history is moving in this direction, liberal democracy is gaining everywhere, and there were reasons to think that. Now, you realize that so much of that was built on sand. And you look at countries that supposedly were going through a transition. That was the big word in the 90s, as if history has a direction and nations would naturally transition from one to another. History is always up for grabs.
Thank you.
I would sort of challenge your notion of identity. Within the context of American society has always been an identity-based society with straight white men at the top, the tribe at the top. So I think that tension is what we're living out today, because, and I have many white male friends, and I sense it in them also, that there's this challenge to the power of this tribe in society, okay? And of course, the current president embodies that, what he sees as a challenge. He's the great defender. I'm gonna make America great again. We know who he's speaking to. Okay, so now, with this challenge, to this particular tribe, this is a fundamental tension in American society. How do you see that resolving itself? It's a power struggle, okay? So fundamentally, it's a power struggle.
Right.
So
Okay.
I agree with that. Yeah. I agree with that. Now, it's important to think of it as a power struggle. It's not about, the real struggle is a power struggle. It's not just to get people to use certain kind of words and things like that. It's about concrete power. To fight power, you need power. To have power in this country, you need to win elections, or you need economic power. To win elections, you need to appeal to all sorts of different people, including the white majority. So you have a stake in convincing them that you share something with them that gives you a claim on them right? That's not to deny the reality that your equal citizenship is not being denied, but you need that concept of citizenship as the weapon.
But how do you do that when this particular tribe sees this as a zero-sum game? If you gain something, I'm losing something.
Well, right, but the rhetoric of groups just feeds into that sense that if one group wins, another group is losing. And in fact, things do change in this country, and they have changed in this country. And they change either because our mores change because of moral education, or because people get power. And if you want power, you got to go to the center of this country, to Republican counties, you got to go to VFW halls, you got to go to churches, and you got to talk to people for your cause.
I just want to make one more comment.
No,
Darrell.
actually, no. Let's
Just one more, please. I think you should, what I didn't hear from you is the Republican project starting with the defeat of Goldwater in '64. They had a long game plan,
Yeah.
okay, how they were going to seize power.
Well, no one has any plans. That's not the way the world works. But it started then, that's for sure. And out here in the Southwest, yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, you kind of took a little bit of my thunder, but I do want to press you on one thing, which I don't think you've answered, respectfully. When you have a group that is motivated by fear of losing their power, how do you communicate with them? What specifically do you say to people like that to create that sense of citizenship that can break through that fear? Because that's what we're confronted with today. You have a group of people who are scared to death that they're going to lose their power. And how do you break through that and create a community so that the other side, as you say, can start winning elections?
Okay. Well, to begin with, that's not the whole story of American politics right now. There is not one group. We have the people who voted for Trump overwhelmingly were not economically powerful. Right. Well,
Whatever you want to call it.
right. Well, look, I grew up in blue-collar Detroit. Do not go there and tell people how much power they have. When they're worrying, it's exactly the point. It is exactly the point that power in this country is not easily defined and seen by saying that there's one group that has a view together, that has an interest together, and other people have a very different one. It's just not social reality in this country. People are worried about their families. They are worried about health care. They are worried about education. They are worried about the fact that their kids are going to be less economic successfully than themselves. This is the overwhelming concern of Trump voters. And if you're shaking your head, it's because you haven't talked to enough of them.
Okay, we also have time for a reception afterwards. You might be able to continue that conversation with Professor Lilla then.
So first and foremost, as a liberal, I agree with you. I'm tired of losing, but I want to talk about a Democrat who recently won. A lot of people have attributed Doug Jones's victory in Alabama to identity politics. He spoke on a lot of issues that were of importance to the African American community. And obviously, I'm a white Midwesterner. I shouldn't really be speaking about this, but I'm wondering if there is any role in regards to identity politics in winning elections. Do you think that helped Doug Jones pull off that amazing victory? I mean, after all the exit polls showed that it was African American voters who won him the election rather than suburban white college educated people.
Oh, right. But see, I don't see that as identity politics in the way I've described it. There is an issue there that certain citizens in his district feel excluded and feel that the benefits are not coming to them. He talks about that. Part of that has a racial element to it, but he's addressing the actual concern. And so, and the things that they are suffering can be stated in terms of what is not being given to them as citizens. And so that's the time not to talk about differences, but about the fact that people who are like us, who are fellow citizens, are being denied something. I'll give you another example. This was in the news. This was somewhere in Northern Virginia. in a state legislative district. There was a woman named Danica Rum. I don't know if people here know her, but she is a transgender woman who wears a rainbow scarf all the time and plays in a heavy metal band. And the person representing her district was the most homophobic public official openly in Virginia. She decided to take him on. She never denied who she was. She never took off her scarf. She talked about electricity. She talked about schools. She talked about taxes. She talked about all those things. He's the one who ran on identity politics, not her. And he was crushed. That, for me, is a model of political engagement right now. And I'm heartened by the fact that in the Democratic Party, you have groups of people now who want to run for office, and they're incredibly diverse. But they seem focused, considering the ones who have won their primaries and stuff like that, they're focused on the issues at hand. And that's the way to win power. Once you have power, then you can help people however you want.
So you're saying that Democrats can, oh, sorry.
So I'm just sorry, we've got 3 people. If we can do
gotcha.
3 quick questions and maybe 3 quick answers. So we go.
Before I begin, I feel it necessary to give a little bit of background on myself. I realize I'm of mixed ethnicity. My mother is Puerto Rican. My father is some amalgamation of German and French. And one of the things that we see in this country is it is becoming increasingly more and more mixed. People are mixing together, the whole melting pot idea. But we also see rhetoric today that black men that marry white women are traitors to their race. And we see a lot of exclusionary rhetoric that says that if you are to mix and if you are to go out of your race in terms of your personal relationships, in terms of your culture, then that's somehow wrong. And I see that as a major issue, and I'm wondering how the increased mixing in this country, and especially with the idea that this country is based on ideas, not so much the location or the language of the people, that it's the ideas there, how that affects your thinking of identity politics.
Well, the country's based on a lot of things, right? And there are explicit things and not so explicit things, the fact that this was a Protestant country and so on. No, I think that the blurring of racial and ethnic identities is very interesting to track. You'll hear people say this is soon going to be a majority-minority country, which, in terms of categories, if you look at people's first identification, it can look that way. But the largest group that's growing now are people who have multiple identifications. And it turns out that if one of those identities is white, that person, in terms of voting and things like that, follows a white pattern, right? So it's a chimera to think that somehow, if there is a change of that kind of balance, that everything is going to go in the Democratic direction. It's also the case that people in identity groups do not all share the same politics, just like white people who voted for Trump. There was a surprisingly significant portion of the Hispanic male vote that voted for Trump. Latinos and Latinas are Catholic and are opposed to abortion. Homosexuality is a charged issue in the African American community. And as every group becomes more economically successful, they tend to move to the right. So the whole picture is very, very mixed up. But because of that, I think it's going to be harder to talk in simple-minded terms about white America, not white America, and how that is going to fall out politically for the parties.
Okay, two final questions. Just be brief, please.
First off, I'd like to thank you for coming to speak to us today and taking our questions. I really do appreciate it. So, with your speech and what you talked to us today, it seems like you have 2 opposing views Americans have. You have one that's like a nearsighted, almost like a camera. It's a nearsighted view on the world, and then there's one that's a far-sighted view on the world. However, like with a camera, what happens is if you have a nearsighted view, you cannot necessarily see the far-sighted and vice versa. So what it seems like today is we have people who are very focused on themselves and have very nearsighted views. And even those who are focused on, large minority groups and such, fail to see like a nearsighted perspective of issues like you mentioned with evangelicals and such. And I know you said that it seems like we're going to, it's like there's not a happy ending, but I'd like to challenge and say, like, what do you think about like voting in politicians who are willing to work on like two sides and have bipartisanship? And what about like working in dialogue to grow these groups and together through understanding and talking? Like maybe not just having a dialogue of minorities, but also having people understand people from all different origins.
Yeah. You can't count on people being good in life, and especially in politics. You got to assume that you cannot necessarily appeal to their higher nature. Maybe eventually you can, right? So what you first have to appeal to is, what Tocqueville called individual interests properly understood. And you need to help people understand that they have a stake in a wider view. I guess you're talking about the iPhone, which I don't understand, but with a kind of close view and far view. Even getting people to focus on citizenship is also a very practical appeal, which is that if you want to change things, you need political power. To have political power, you need to appeal to people unlike yourselves. So even from a purely strategic point of view, this would be a good thing to do. And then there are side benefits, right?
Thank you.
Last question, Diva.
It's a short question, Dr. Reese, don't worry. So let's say you abandon the use of identity politics to win elections, but then once you're actually governing, how do you ensure that issues based on identity are resolved?
By continuing to hold power. It's the only way.
So if your messaging is about like improving healthcare or like improving infrastructure, how do you ensure that issues that aren't around like consensus issues that only affect certain identities are resolved? Like where does that political will come from?
Once you hold power, you can do a lot because a lot of things happen under the radar. So for example, the Justice Department under President Obama was able to achieve a lot in small ways by changing various things that are done in the workplace, especially oversight of the police and various things like that. But you don't have to run on that necessarily, right? If you keep people happy on certain things, people are busy, and they don't always know everything else that's going on. But it means getting power first and also knowing that if you cross certain lines, that you might risk losing your power and not being able to do anything. And there's nothing people in movement politics hate more than to hear that they have to go slow or be careful. But if you don't, you flame out and you end up not being able to help anybody. So you got to be patient. Max Weber, the sociologist, once called politics the slow drilling through hard boards. And that's what it is to do institutional politics. You just have to keep at it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, with that lesson on hard work, I have a few closing remarks, and then again, we invite you to a reception. So all the students present, again, get information on the school, our courses for the spring, and the major that we have, the minor that we have. Everyone here is welcome to come to future events in the series. Coming just in October, we have Ross Douthat, a columnist for the New York Times, talking about religion and polarization in politics. Then we have an extraordinary set of Tocqueville scholars. Professor Lilla mentioned Tocqueville twice, his classic work from the 19th century, Democracy in America. We have 4 extraordinary scholars coming to talk about current lessons and wisdom we could learn from that book. I want to thank again our partners, Arizona PBS, the Cronkite School of Journalism, the O'Connor College of Law. I do have to say thank you to the school's staff that put on these terrific events. First, our Associate Director for Public Programs, Dr. Carol McNamara, and Ty and Taylor and Gala and student workers and other staff who helped to put in this event. Thanks to Kenja Hassan for joining me in asking the questions. We hope to see you at future events, and please join me for one final thanks to Professor Mark Lilla.
Thank you. Make sure you vote next month.